Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist by David Hartsough with Joyce Holliday. Chapter 11, The World is Watching, Facing Down Death Squads. Just as the war in Vietnam finally ended, so did the worst of the violent conflicts that devastated Central America a decade and a half later. But the US war machine has a perpetual mission, and other targets were being sought for its firepower and domination. In February 1986, the surprising people power revolution in the Philippines nonviolently overthrew the ruthless US-supported regime of Ferdinand Marcos, known as the Hitler of Southeast Asia. It brought high hopes for fundamental change in that suffering country. But the anticipated end to corruption and greed and the advent of agrarian reform never materialized. Massive structural injustice persisted, and so did a guerrilla insurgency committed to political change. In April 1989, a large-scale government military campaign named Operation Thunderbolt took aim at the southern portion of the Philippine island of Negros. In the name of wiping out the communists, 35,000 people were driven out of their homes under the bombs of helicopter gunships and F-5 fighter jets supplied by the United States. General Raimondo Jarque, commanding officer of the Army's 301st Brigade in Negros, is reported to have said, "I am willing to kill 1 million people if need be to flush out the insurgents and save democracy." 3 months later, at the invitation of the Philippine Council of Churches, I joined a delegation from the Northern California Ecumenical Council with a desire to understand the challenges and struggles that the Filipino people faced. We spent most of our time in Manila, and we also visited the US Naval Base at Subic Bay. We heard a great deal of criticism and resentment of the US military presence. One angry Filipino told us bitterly, "The US bases do not represent peace on earth, but war on earth. The US military bases here are a pact with the devil." Toward the end of our trip, I went with a few others to the small, stricken island of Negros. It was eerily reminiscent of the tragedies I had witnessed elsewhere. Almost the entire island was covered with sugar plantations. The sight of them brought back memories of Cuba, though the poverty there made Cuba look almost rich. Most of the people lived in extremely substandard housing with virtually no clothes and very little to eat. I visited one family whose little home was built on stilts. They had one small wooden in which the whole family slept. The only job available, receiving $1.50 for a day's work. Like thousands of others, he was exploited so that we Americans could eat and drink plenty of sugar at cheap prices. Our delegation met with Deputy Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos, who was one of 2 generals who had defected from the Marcos government during the revolution. Ramos made very clear to us that the military was still running the show in terms of security. The prevailing mindset required herding people into strategic hamlets, our failed strategy in Vietnam. As in that neighboring Asian country, this plan was backed up with bombing runs against the civilian population. The bombing target was an area about the size of the state of Rhode Island. Most of the people living there had fled the lush and tropical rolling green hills of their ancestral lands, leaving behind livelihoods and livestock, carrying only their children, the sick, and the elderly. Some trekked for weeks to escape the bombs, and hundreds, mostly children, died from exhaustion and hunger. Many took refuge in church buildings and the grounds around them, mostly Catholic. In Bacolod, the capital of Negros, we visited the social hall of the Sacred Heart Seminary. 600 refugees were huddled in groups all over the floor, sitting on small piles of bedding, with the cries of the young and coughs of the old filling the air. We heard stories of unconscionable brutality. 60-year-old Dionisia Grande told us that her son Freddie had gone to the river near their home to bathe and wash clothes. Armed vigilantes accused him of being part of the New People's Army guerrilla movement. They stabbed him, cut off his head, and took the head to the military commander, who rewarded them with a bag of rice. Joni Gonzalez was a very small 14-year-old. Soldiers entered his home and brutally killed his father in front of his entire family. Joni, his mother, and his 4 younger brothers fled into the forest, where they subsisted for 2 months on roots, bananas, and wild fruits, and suffered oppressive heat and cold. Weakened by hunger and exposure, Joni's mother and one of his brothers contracted malaria and died. Joni was left with the responsibility of caring for his surviving 3 brothers. Soldiers had fired into the home of the Alojado family, shooting infant Boye Alojado in her mother's arms. Her young parents walked 3 hours to the nearest town carrying their wounded baby. She died soon after their arrival for lack of medicine at the clinic there. In one corner of the hall, an elderly man lay still on a blanket, his family all in tears, sobbing as the reality sunk in that they had lost not only their home and their village, they had lost also their father. No words were spoken as this family was overwhelmed with grief. Not long after I sat with them, I heard that in another corner of the room, a baby had been born. Rejoicing drifted through the hall at the good news that he had been born alive, even healthy, under such tragic circumstances. But it didn't take long for people to wonder sadly what kind of life this child would have. The infant Geraldine Briones died while we were visiting the refugees. Her beautiful little body was placed in a tiny homemade wooden coffin and taken to the front of the chapel. I knelt with her family and wept with every pore of my body, feeling as if I had lost my own daughter. Pawns in the war games of others, the people had fled to this church hall to save their lives. They were hoping against hope that they could someday return home. In trembling voices, they told us that not long before our arrival, death squads had visited the hall and threatened to kill them all if they didn't leave within 3 days and surrender to the governor. The threat was broadcast on several radio stations. This was the refugees' punishment for walking to the governor's office to request compensation for their destroyed homes, livestock, and crops. They had also asked that the military disband paramilitary vigilante groups known as CAFCUS, Civilian Armed Forces Geographical Units, in their area, so that they could return home and live safely. A representative of the governor told them that they could return home only under the conditions that they submit to military control and that all their men join the CAFCUS. Unwilling to inflict on others the torture and violence that they had suffered, the people refused these terms. The military responded by sending 8 truckloads of soldiers who surrounded the refugees and drove them at gunpoint back to the seminary. Soon after, the death squads arrived, spewing their terrible threat. Bishop Antonio Fortich lived at the cemetery in a home that had been both burned and bombed because of his courageous calls for land reform. He said of his persecutors, "I have forgiven all of them." In stunning and characteristic good humor, the bishop appealed to the military. "Please do not bomb my house. It is hard to rebuild. And please do not bomb my residence. It is hard to sleep." As in Central America, religious leaders working for justice were specifically targeted for repression. 37 Catholic priests in Negros were on the death squad's hit list, and 11 pastors of United Church of Christ congregations had been murdered. Many religious leaders had received death threats with the message, Your days are numbered. Signed, KKK Kafkas. Bishop Fortich was nominated that year for the Nobel Peace Prize by the American Friends Service Committee. I was the first Quaker he met after the nomination, and I was on the receiving end of a great deal of love and appreciation from him. He felt deeply the pain of the people in the church hall and wept as we related what we had seen and heard. They had already suffered so much. Where could they go? What could they do? I shared some of the experiences of Witness for Peace and Peace Brigades International in Central America, and his eyes lit up. I watched the despair that had been written on the bishop's face melt into hope. He said, "That's what we will do. We will invite international religious people to come and be present with those refugees until the threat is over." We had very little time. The death squad's deadline was looming. It was about 6:30 in the morning, and our delegation was scheduled to catch a plane back to Manila at 7:30. So the bishop hastily dictated a letter inviting international religious people to come to the church hall in Bacolod. Our group flew to Manila, typed up his invitation, and faxed it out to every international we knew who was connected to any kind of religious institution. Many, including several Catholic Maryknoll missionaries, were already in the Philippines. Within 30 hours, we had 25 international religious people from the Philippines, United States, Australia, France, and Switzerland present in that church hall in Bacolod. Surrounded by the vulnerable refugees, we held a press conference. Addressing the members of the death squads, we said, "We are appealing to you to treat all of these people as your brothers and sisters and as children of God, and not to carry through on your threats to kill them. We want you to know that we are going to be here with them, and whatever you do to them, you will have to do to us. We also want you to know that the eyes of the world are watching what happens here." I canceled my flight home and stayed with the others in the hall for a few days until it was clear that the death squads had backed down. I spent a few more days with a family that lived nearby, trying to spread the word about the Witness in Bacolod. This was in the early days of computers and email, and the 5-year-old and his family helped me figure out how to use it to tell my family I was okay. In the weeks that followed, the refugees slowly filtered home. They established zones of peace, as proposed by Bishop Fortich. Some of the international religious witnesses agreed to help organize long-term protection for the victims of the Civil War and remained in the area. I witnessed once again the power of nonviolent presence and solidarity, the profound truth of our common humanity, and the transforming role that Christians and other religious and concerned people can play, usually at fairly low cost to ourselves, to help protect people who are struggling for justice or are caught in war zones. If ever I doubted, I knew then that we are one human family. We really do have a responsibility to stand up for one another, and we can actually make the world safer for all of us when we act on that belief. That trip to the Philippines gave me the inspiration for the next years of my journey. I wanted to explore even more deeply nonviolent witness in conflict zones around the world. I decided to start by returning to places that had opened my eyes and changed my life when I was a young man. Russia. On August 19th, 1991, citizens of Moscow woke up to find thousands of tanks on their city streets. Some disgruntled members of the Soviet government were staging a coup to oust President Mikhail Gorbachev. They were hardline communists opposed to Gorbachev's reforms, particularly perestroika, economic, political, and social restructuring, and glasnost, openness and détente with the West. I visited right after the coup attempt and heard the extraordinary story. The coup leaders had instituted a curfew and ordered the military to attack and bomb the White House, the Russian Parliament building. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, arrived at the White House and called for a general strike and resistance to the coup. Thousands of ordinary citizens all over Moscow gathered up their courage and risked their lives in this effort to save their society and support its movement away from the dictatorship of the past and toward democracy. They surrounded the tanks and greeted the soldiers with cakes, cigarettes, and roses. Some knocked on the tanks and shouted questions. Why are you here? Who gave you orders? Who are you going to shoot? Women and girls showered the soldiers with kisses and hugs and pleaded with them not to kill the people. For 3 days and nights, between 10,000 and 40,000 people surrounded the White House, much of the time in driving rain. They linked arms, forming a living ring to nonviolently protect their elected government, erecting a human barrier between the building and the tens of thousands of soldiers and their tanks. The protesters built barricades out of trolley cars, buses, pieces of metal, and box springs. They weren't naive enough to believe that these would stop the tanks, but the barricades bought time, enabling them to enter into dialogue with the attacking soldiers about what they were doing and to try to convince them to turn around. I will never forget my friend Valia, who had a daughter and young grandson. She and her daughter felt that this was a critical moment in history, and this was a cause for which they were willing to die. They took turns at the barricade so that if one was killed, the other could raise the young boy. The Russian women kept reminding other protesters not to hurt the soldiers. They're our sons and brothers, Ruzana Ilyushina, chair of the Russian Peace Society, said. We women must be the first to meet the soldiers with words of kindness. We are standing not for struggle, but for peace. Our goal is nonviolence. Our arms are words and kindness, she added. We shouldn't be frightened of anything. Our people are around us. We are defending justice, legality, and freedom. Many of the soldiers were won over. Troops under the direction of the KGB, the Soviet secret police, refused orders to enter Moscow and attack the White House when they learned that they would have to kill hundreds or even thousands of civilians to fulfill their mission. Some courageous media people refused to censor their reports, and a few employees of banned newspapers published an underground paper, mimeographed and photocopied for dissemination, and posted at bus and subway stops. Mayor Sobchak of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, went on TV and encouraged people to gather at the Palace Square the next day. Word spread and 400,000 people showed up. The Russian people had overcome their fear. The coup leaders had at their disposal almost 4 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and sophisticated aircraft and nuclear weapons. The world's second most powerful military machine was overcome by a people armed with courage and conviction, who were no longer willing to cooperate with illegitimate authority or be scared into submission by threats of death or imprisonment. Without the cooperation of the Soviet people, including many in the armed forces, police, and media, as well as ordinary citizens, the coup leaders were powerless. After 3 days, the attempted coup was defeated. During my visit that August, members of the Living Ring invited some of us from the United States who were knowledgeable about nonviolence to train them in civilian-based defense. They wanted to be even better prepared to defend their society nonviolently against future coup attempts. Under the sponsorship of Nonviolence International, we returned in mid-November. 400 Russians participated in the workshops we organized. We honored our hosts' request to lead trainings in nonviolent defense, but we felt we had a great deal to learn from them as well. Many positive developments followed. The group Golubka, Peace Dove, organized an international conference on nonviolence on the first anniversary of the coup attempt. Some Russians began working to get conscientious objector legislation passed. Others were cooperating with the Mujahideen, their former enemies in Afghanistan, to find ways to end that senseless war, which was killing 100 people every day. The coup attempt and the People's Living Ring were a major contributing factor to the destabilization and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day, 1991. The Berlin Wall had already come down in November 1989, and reforms and liberalization were transforming the nations of the formerly pro-Soviet Eastern Bloc. That moment provided an unprecedented opportunity to drastically cut back the Soviet and US military establishments and convert both nations into peacetime societies committed to meeting the needs of their citizens. Both were in economic distress, struggling under the stranglehold of massive resource-draining military machines. Conditions were particularly grim in Russia. In the 3 weeks that I was there in November and December 1991, I hardly met a Russian who had eaten what Americans would consider a full meal. Long lines created waits of up to 11 hours for staples such as bread, eggs, meat, fish, and milk. Shelves in the grocery stores I visited were 95% empty. The official word was that Moscow had only a 3-day supply of food. Hundreds of thousands of people were losing their jobs in the crumbling Soviet society. Fuel shortages were expected that winter in a country where temperatures could reach 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. High inflation had reduced the value of a typical Russian salary to the equivalent of $2.50 to $7.50 per month. I was involved in efforts to send financial support for food and medicine to Russia, and I encouraged sister city and sister church partnerships between the United States and Russia. I also asked people in the United States to put pressure on their legislators to follow Russia's example and halt further nuclear weapons development, and to call for massive cuts in the US military budget. Big changes on the world's political scene were mirrored in my personal desire to shift my vocational energy. After 18 good years working with the American Friends Service Committee, budget cuts and my hope to channel more energy toward international peacemaking spurred a change. In 1993, I became the executive director of Peace Workers, a community of activists primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area, whose mission is to strengthen and promote nonviolent movements for peace and justice in the United States and around the world. Supported entirely by donations, I wrote articles, spoke at conferences, and led workshops to build momentum for peace workers. Unfortunately, my hope that the United States and Russia would view the end of the Cold War as a perfect moment to convert both our societies to peacetime economies was quickly dashed. Our nation chose instead to show its muscle as the only remaining superpower and escalate its obscenely massive investments in war making. And tragically, the commitment to military dominance was matched by an equally fervent pursuit of political and economic domination around the globe. On January 1st, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico went into effect. Supporters, including many of the world's largest corporations, claimed it would create jobs and raise standards of living. Opponents, which included many labor, religious, and environmental groups, saw NAFTA as a vehicle for outsourcing US jobs, undermining democratic control of domestic policymaking, raising corporate profits, and threatening health, environmental, and food safety standards. As we now know, this disastrous experiment has wreaked havoc on millions of lives here and in Mexico and Canada. Mexico. The same day that NAFTA took effect, the Zapatistas launched their uprising in Chiapas, Mexico. Viewing NAFTA as the start of major globalization and the beginning of the end of their indigenous way of life, they demanded a better life for peasants, self-determination, and fair elections. This revolutionary group was in a standoff with the Mexican military when Samuel Ruiz, the Catholic bishop in Chiapas and the primary mediator between the government and the Zapatistas, appealed to internationals to come and be a peaceful and protective presence. Inspired by Ruiz's call, Medea Benjamin of Global Exchange, Phil McManus of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and I organized a delegation of leaders from religious communities around the United States. We spent 10 days in Chiapas. The poverty and violence that I had witnessed a decade before had only intensified. Our delegation went to Chiapas to observe and report the truth, encourage dialogue between the factions, support a negotiated settlement, discourage human rights abuses on all sides, and accompany those working for a peace process. Observing how entrenched the challenges were, we launched a new organization called SIPAZ, SIPAZ, translated International Service for Peace, which has maintained an international nonviolent presence in Chiapas ever since. I returned again to Chiapas with another delegation in February 1995. We were in the town of San Cristobal de las Casas when word came that Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo was sending the military into the surrounding Lacandan jungle to capture 5 Zapatista leaders. We watched, horrified, as thousands of soldiers and hundreds of machine gun mounted armored personnel carriers rolled into villages all across Chiapas to set up staging areas for their attacks. Fear was rampant in Chiapas, and so was suspicion that the US government was putting pressure on Mexico to resolve the Zapatista problem quickly. US military attaches had been cited, and Chase Manhattan Bank had reportedly circulated a memo calling for more aggressive military actions by the Mexican government to eliminate the Zapatistas. As a sign of support, the United States extended a $51 billion line of credit to the Mexican government. Some of our group went to the office of CONPAS, the Non-Governmental Coordinating Committee for Humanitarian Aid in Chiapas, where they escorted the staff out past special police armed with machine guns and plainclothes police with pistols who had arrived in unmarked cars. Others went to the Catholic Chancery in San Cristobal, which housed the Diocesan Human Rights Office. And still others went to the home of Amado Avendaño Figueroa, head of the transitional government in rebellion and recently installed as governor of Chiapas by the Zapatistas, who claimed that the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, had stolen the gubernatorial election. A Catholic priest, Padre Joel from Zimojaville, a village 2 hours away, wanted to return to be present with his people during the escalating military occupation. Marlene Bertke, a Benedictine sister from Erie, Pennsylvania, and I volunteered to accompany him. Marlene had been with the group that went to the Chancery, and while there, she had handed Bishop Ruiz a brochure about the upcoming National Assembly of Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace Organization. When she asked the bishop if he was still planning to be the keynote speaker, he replied, "If I am alive and can leave the country, I will be there." These words were on both our minds when Marlene and I met the priest. He was a beautiful, dedicated man with a deep love for his people. He lived in Zimojaville, but circulated among many other small communities, visiting each one every 3 months or so. He had recently been detained for 50 days by police because of his work for justice. He knew that it could happen again at any time. The military had occupied his village 2 months before, arriving just before Christmas as he and his congregation's children were walking out of the church. They were keeping the annual ritual of La Posada, a pilgrimage from house to house seeking a place for the Christ child to be born. The soldiers stepped back as the procession of singing children passed. Padre Joel told us he felt fear about returning to his village, but he wanted to be with his people as the tanks and soldiers were converging again. We agreed to leave at 6 o'clock the next morning. That evening, Marlene and I talked about which one of us would sit next to the priest in the front seat of the pickup truck, recognizing that whoever sat there was the more likely to get shot. We agreed that I would take that seat, and I brought along a couple of extra t-shirts to use to help stop blood flow if needed. We left contact information and instructions for one of our group to get in touch with family members if we got killed. We were nervous as we started out early the next morning. It did nothing to reassure us when the priest said, "My life is life only if I'm willing to hand it over." I hoped to be able to claim that kind of courage and faith. As we approached the first military checkpoint, my heart was pounding and I took a deep breath as Marlene dangled her rosary out the window, believing that the soldiers were likely Catholic and would honor it. We had contingency plans in place. If Marlene and I were stopped, the priest would return with us to San Cristobal. If he was arrested, we would demand to be taken with him to jail. Thankfully, we were waved through without any trouble. The trip turned out to be an uneventful 4-hour drive, a long Spanish lesson for Marlene and me, once Padre Joel turned off the radio, with a wonderfully devoted man of faith and compassion. Marlene and I rode a bus back to San Cristobal later that day. The next evening, when our group went to our usual restaurant for dinner, the owner handed us a flyer. He told us that copies had been distributed widely in the city and warned us to be careful. The message of the flyer was essentially, get rid of the foreigners, get rid of those collaborating with them. It was a little hard to enjoy our meal that night. A few positive signs appeared while we were there. On February 14th, President Zedillo called for the Mexican army to halt all offensive military operations in Chiapas. Chiapas's governor, Robledo, offered to resign. For the moment, at least, a few steps had been taken back from the brink. I spent another month with CPAS in Chiapas in 1996, and then an additional week on the edge of an indigenous settlement that sympathized with the Zapatistas. Its members were working to build a self-reliant community beyond the grasp of NAFTA. A Mexican human rights organization was setting up peace houses where international teams lived in the threatened communities in an effort to discourage military attacks on the villages. Other organizations committed to a peaceful resolution in Chiapas joined peace workers in sustaining the work of CPAS. Eventually, we expanded the project to include other parts of Mexico, including Oaxaca and Guerrero. A campaign of peaceful civil resistance was launched in the neighboring state of Tabasco, also with support from peacemakers. As in Chiapas, the PRI had stolen the 1994 election for governor from Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the progressive candidate. Thousands of people marched more than 600 miles to Mexico City to protest. A truck loaded with 14 boxes of original documents appeared in the square. They were evidence that the PRI had spent $70 million on the election, an amount more than Bill Clinton had spent that year in the entire United States on his presidential campaign. This came to $250 per vote in a state with 2 million inhabitants, illegal under the Mexican Constitution, and more than likely financed from illegal drug sales. The other part of the Tabasco resistance campaign included protests at Pemex oil installations. These had contaminated the lands, lakes, and lagoons, and destroyed the livelihoods and lives of thousands of farmers and fishermen throughout the region. As I visited former fishing areas totally contaminated with oil, and homes and farms of campesinos with oil pipelines through their front yards and across their fields, often leaking and sometimes even exploding, my heart wept. Peace workers helped get the word out in the United States about the plight of the Mexican people who were victims of our oil addiction. We supported Rafael Landereche, a Mexican with Servicio Paz y Justicia, Service for Peace and Justice, who helped to organize the nonviolent campaign in Tabasco, demanding that Pemex stop drilling oil wells until the company compensated those who had suffered losses. Hundreds of people blockaded the oil installations in 12-hour shifts around the clock. Their strategies included a march of 30,000 people, hunger strikes, and filling the jails to expose the destruction of their communities. I was heartened that peace workers was able to support such courageous campaigns in many corners of the globe. That year, I knew I needed to return to one more place that held many warm and profound memories for me. Sadly, it was now known as the former Yugoslavia.